Good evening, everybody. It's nice to see you. If you're joining us online, good evening. And if you're joining us via Facebook Live, good evening too. It's great to have you with us. We have been journeying through John's Gospel by looking at some of the signs. There are 7, some people would say 8 of them, in John's Gospel that point in distinctive ways to who Jesus is and to what he's done and how that impacts our lives today. And tonight we want to reflect on a story that is recorded in John, in Matthew, and in the Gospel of Mark. And that is Jesus walking on a stormy sea toward his disciples who were in a boat, and him getting into the boat with them and the storm ceasing. It's a powerful and moving story that challenges much of our understanding of nature. It's an inexplicable story because human beings don't walk on water. But in this story, we hear of Jesus doing that. In fact, some years ago, I was speaking at an evening which was called an apologetics evening. And that's basically an evening when you give defense or explanation for some aspects of the Christian faith. And this one was arranged in Hampshire, and there were lots of very, very posh people at it, including one member of the royal family. I'll not tell you which one, but her husband was the Duke of York. And I was talking a little bit about this miracle as part of the conversation. And she stopped me and she said, "Do you really believe that Jesus walked on water?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "Do I have to believe that if I'm to become a Christian or a follower of Jesus?" I said, "No, you don't." Now, some of you will be surprised by that. But you don't have to believe in the miracles to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And you don't have to believe that every single word in the Bible is infallible, as I do believe, in order to be a Christian. That's not the qualification for a Christian. The only qualification for a Christian is this: do you believe that Jesus Christ died and rose again for you? That he died so that your sins could be forgiven. Now, I do believe in that miracle, and I do believe in all of this book, but that is not a qualification that is required of you in order to be a Christian. Sometimes we can end up setting lots and lots of rules and regulations on people that aren't fair. But as I was returning home that night, I thought, why do I believe that Jesus walked on water? Just because somebody else has told me? Is that why? Is it an a priori position that I've taken simply because I believe the Bible to be the inspired and infallible Word of God? And all of those are true. But here's why fundamentally I believe that the story of Jesus turning water, walking on water is true. In philosophy and in Hebrew thinking, and Jesus was a Jew, the truth is the ultimate expression of reality. Whatever is true is more substantial than anything else. And Jesus said in John chapter 14, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." That means that he is more substantially real than the chair that you're sitting on, the air that you breathe, and the room that we're sitting in, and than water. No wonder he could then walk on it, because he created it in the first place. He's able to do anything he likes, in any context he likes, in any way that he likes. And tonight I want to explore that Jesus will do anything that is needed to get to you if you are willing to let him. If you need Christ, he is here. If you need him in your heart, he's here. If you need him to touch you, he's here. If you need him to forgive you, he will do it. If you need him to come alongside you, he'll do it. He will do anything to get to you. And I pray that whether you're online via the web or online via Facebook or in this room, that God by his Holy Spirit will do something so powerful tonight that your life will never be the same again. Doesn't matter how old you are. Doesn't matter what gender you are. Doesn't matter what you're facing today. My prayer is that God will touch this meeting and touch your life in a profound way, and that you'll never be the same again. So let's read the story of Jesus walking on the water to get to his disciples from John's Gospel. It's found in John chapter 6, verses 16 to 24. I'll give you a chance to find it. The stewards do have Bibles if you don't have any with you and you'd like to read it. please do just wave your hand at them or something. Does anybody need a Bible? Yeah, there are a few people. There's a couple of people here at the front too, Andy. Whilst you're finding that and Andy's giving out Bibles, there's a lady here in the middle. That's great. I was going to say talk to one another, but I don't think I need to. I think you've all got them now. John chapter 6. Have everybody found it? Yes? Great. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there. They also saw that Jesus had not got into the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone. Then some boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum, looking for Jesus. Amen. God always blesses the public reading of his inspired and his infallible word. These disciples forgot that Jesus wasn't there, which is a bit odd. When you read the story, it sounds like they have carried on, and in the middle of a storm, they realized that Jesus wasn't there. They just assumed that something else had happened. But when you read the story more carefully, you understand why that happened. For example, in Mark's version of the story, in chapter 6, we read that he had told them to go ahead to Capernaum. So of course they assumed that he was going to walk round the lake and meet them at the other side. So it's not as odd or as unusual as it might sound. In verse 16 of John 6, we read again, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. Sometimes it can feel like God isn't there. Perhaps it's because we've forgotten something that he said, or maybe it's because we've allowed ourselves to get distracted, or to get caught up with our work, our bank balances, our careers, our lives. Perhaps our pasts are more important than our presents. Perhaps what people have said to us over the years has become more important than what Jesus is saying to us today. Whatever the reason, the story of Jesus walking on water to reach his disciples reminds us that God will not abandon us. It's told, as I said earlier, in Mark chapter 6, verses 42 to 52. That was written around about 66 to 70 AD, so within 30 years of Jesus dying. It's also told in Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. That was written about 20 years later or so, between 80 and 90 AD. In that account, Peter gets out of the boat and walks towards Jesus, then starts to sink, and Jesus reaches out his hand and rescues him. And it's also told in our Bible verse tonight, in John chapter 6, which was the latest of the Gospels and was written probably about 90 to 100 AD. So within 65 years or so of Jesus being crucified, these 3 stories had been written down and were being told across the church. That's closer evidence of this story than there is to prove that Julius Caesar existed. And there's about 10 or 20 times more evidence about Jesus and who he is and what he claimed to be than there is of much of early Roman history, for example. So as we read this story, don't read it just through eyes that say it couldn't be true because it's miraculous. Read it through the eyes of people who recognize that the people who wrote it down saw it, and that thousands and thousands, in fact all of the Christians, for hundreds of years were willing to stake their lives on it. There's something about this story which is powerful. All 3 stories, all 3 accounts, place Jesus is walking on water after the story of him feeding the 5,000 people. Why are they together? Why do they link in the way that they do? Why does that matter? Why does John do that in his gospel too? I want to explore the story tonight simply. You can't do it profoundly. But I want to say to you that as I do, God is here. In this room. It's an audacious, perhaps arrogant claim if you didn't believe it. That the creator of the heavens and the earth is in this room. Sitting right beside you. He's at home with you, wherever you are in the web. He's watching with you on Facebook Live. And that he's interested in your life. He's not a bystander. He's not a spectator. He wants to be a participant. And he wants you to invite him to walk with you. That's his aim. That's his desire. And that's his heart. So as we explore this story, remember that. There are 4 simple ideas I want to leave with you that are pulled out of Jesus walking on the water across the storm of the storm-tossed Sea of Galilee to get to his disciples. The first one is very simple. Jesus sees the storms that we face. Just as he saw the storm that these disciples were facing. When you read Mark's version of the story, you realize that they were acting on the instructions of Jesus. Verse 45 of Mark 6. Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up a mountain to pray. So of course they carried on without him, because he told them to. Get on and go to Bethsaida, and I'll meet you later. He gets rid of the crowd, he displaces or sends his disciples on, and he goes up a mountain to pray. Jesus has dismissed his disciples and sent them ahead of himself. And he goes up a mountain to have time alone with his Father after a busy time of ministry. I assume the disciples thought that he was going ahead and that they would join him when he met them on the other side by foot, a journey of 5 or 6 miles. They certainly knew that he wasn't there when they set out in the boat. But, and here's the big thing, they assumed that because they could not see him, that he could not see them. And that was their mistake. They thought if we can't see him, then he can't see us. Do any of you remember when you were youngsters? Am I the only person that did this? When I was with my mum and went into a room with big people, and she would say, "Come and say hello, Malcolm." And you were shy and embarrassed and you didn't want to do it. And you were like, "I don't want to speak to people I don't know." And you put your hands over your eyes like that. Do you remember that? And you had this childlike assumption, if I can't see them, then they can't see me. If I cover my eyes and I'm not looking at them, then they're not looking at me. In an adult way, the disciples forgot that God could see them. They thought that because he wasn't there, he couldn't see what was happening. But listen to John 6, verses 16 to 18. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. They got into a boat and they started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. So it's dark, except it was probably a full moon. How do I know that? Because the Jews celebrate a number of feasts. One of them is called Passover. And all of their feasts are based on the lunar calendar. So they begin when there's a full moon. And in John chapter 6, verse 4, we are told that it was the time of the feast of Passover. So yes, it was dark, but Jesus had gone up a mountain to pray, and in the moonlit night, he looked across the Sea of Galilee, and he saw that his disciples were in trouble. Listen to these words again from Mark, and this time verse 47. When evening came, the boat was out on the lake, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the lake. So they thought he couldn't see them because they couldn't see him, but he could see them. He saw exactly what they were going through. He saw exactly what was uncertain and what was happening. The same story is told in Matthew 14. Listen again. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. When you read this story really carefully, you begin to see several things. Firstly, he could see them even though they couldn't see him. God can see you. He knows what you're facing. He saw you at the graveside. He saw you in the doctor's surgery. He saw you when you were kneeling and saying, "Where are you? Show yourself to me. Reveal who you are." He saw you. He heard that prayer. He always sees you. The rather challenging side of that is he sees you when you're caught in things that you shouldn't be doing. He's always there. He can always see what we're doing. He knows what we're thinking. Just because we think we can't see him doesn't mean that God can't see us. Remember, these disciples, secondly, were following his instructions, so they weren't out of his will. They didn't hit a storm because they went in the wrong direction. They didn't hit a rough wind because Jesus had said, go left, and they said, no, we fancy going right. He had told them to get in the boat. He told them to start the journey, and then a storm hits. So whatever storms might be present in your life tonight, they're not necessarily present because you're out of God's will. The storms that we face are not evidence that we're doing something God doesn't want us to do. Sometimes they're evidence that we're doing something that God exactly wants us to do. And what we need is his help. Not always, but sometimes. Thirdly, it looks like the struggle in the boat in the storm went on for an awful long time, because when you read the three passages, you read that he saw that it was difficult for them. The waves were battering the boat, the sea was billowing, the wind was howling at night, and he came to them early in the morning, which makes it sound like he left them for several hours battling the storm. Maybe you feel like that. Sometimes it feels like God is leaving us in the middle of a situation that we don't want to be in, doesn't it? Could you please bring an end to it now? And he doesn't do it. There's a mystery about that I don't really understand. There's an inexplicability about that is difficult. But if we're going to be genuine Christians, those of you that are Christians, don't for 1 minute pretend that all you have to do is say, God, come and help, and all your troubles stop like that. Because none of us have had that experience. The reality is that sometimes being a Christian means that you have more questions than people that aren't Christians. Because you're saying, I asked God to help and it doesn't feel as if he has. It doesn't mean he's not there, though. Sometimes our faith is so shallow that we end up just using phrases that we've learned, rather than stopping and thinking and saying, what is God doing in this situation? In the midst of the uncertainty that I faced. This storm, by the way, was real. It wasn't made up. It wasn't imaginary. It wasn't something that wasn't really happening. They couldn't just close their eyes and say, 1, 2, 3, and the storm will be away. When they did it, the storm was still there. They couldn't confess their way out of it. They couldn't pretend their way out of it. They just had to row. They had to keep going. They had to hold on to the fact that they were in the middle of a storm. It didn't frighten them, because they were experienced fishermen. None of the stories say that they were frightened by the storm. But in the midst of it, Jesus sees, and he sees you. He sees you. He sees the uncertainty. He sees the fear. He sees the questions. And he's still there. Second thing is that he does come to help, which is great news. In verse 19 of John 6, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. They were terrified because you don't see people walking on water. Of course they were terrified. It's not like you turn around and think, I know what's going to happen next. We're going to get into a storm, and I know exactly what's going to happen. Jesus is going to walk across the Sea of Galilee, get in the boat, and it'll all be fine. Of course they were terrified. It was an unusual and an unexpected answer to their dilemma. Sometimes God answers us in unexpected ways, right? And those answers might take us by surprise. They might leave us speechless. They might leave us a little unsettled. They might leave us confronted with the great awe and power of God, which is an unsettling thing and shouldn't be taken lightly. But Jesus does come to them. They weren't frightened of the waves. They were alarmed when they saw that Jesus had come. And once again, the presence of the storm didn't mean that God wasn't interested in their lives. The difficulties that they faced didn't negate the dedication of God to them. There's a psalm in the Old Testament. Psalms are just songs written by people in the history of Israel to express their love, or their questions, or their uncertainties, or their longings to God. There are 150 of them. One of them, Psalm 77, tells the story of the people of Israel and how God led them through something called the Red Sea when they were running away from the Egyptians. Listen to verses 16 to 20. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deep trembled, the clouds poured out water, the skies thundered, your arrows flashed on every side, the crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind, your lightnings lit up the world, the earth trembled and shook, your way was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. God is able to do supernatural things to help you tonight, to get to us, to reach us. And it might look impossible. It might look that there's no way that we can get out of the circumstances that we find ourselves in. God can make a way where there doesn't seem to be a way. The third thing is that Jesus actually helps them. He says to them in verse 20, we hear in John 6, "It is I, do not be afraid." If you read the story in Matthew and in Mark, he precedes the "it is I" with "take heart. Don't be afraid. It's me. Take heart. Don't be afraid. It's me." Here's what he does. I would suggest to you that when Jesus reaches these people, he does 5 things. He assures them of his identity and his presence. He says, "I'm here and it is the Jesus that you know." He tells them to take hope, take heart. Thirdly, he tells them not to be afraid. Fourthly, he gets into the boat with them. And lastly, the waves stop. Let me put that another way. He says, "I'm here." He says, "I'm able." He says, "I'm in control." He says, "I'm with you." And he says, "I'm your peace." So what storm are you facing? What uncertainty, what waves are hitting your boat? Marriage on the rocks, finances difficult, body breaking down, uncertain about the future, huge questions about career, finding yourself deeply wealthy and sitting at ease, but inside there's a yearning for you to discover something else. Maybe you've got all the awards, you've won all the acclaim, you've got to the top of the tree, only to find that it's a very shallow place. And you're trying to work out what it means to be alive and to have a purpose and a meaning. Maybe you're worried about your children or your grandchildren. I don't know what you're facing. But hear God offering you peace and strength and hope by saying, "I'm here. I'm able. I'm in control. I'm with you." And when you recognize those 4 things, I'm here, I'm able, I'm in control, and I'm with you, the inevitable consequence is peace. When you know that God is present, when you know that he's with you, when you know that he's in control, and when you know that he cares about you and he's able to do something, the inevitable consequence is peace. Not just a shallow peace, but peace deep in our hearts and in our lives. William Barclay was a Scottish commentator. He doesn't believe that Jesus walked on water, by the way. He doesn't believe in any of the miracles. But in his commentary on John, he has a wonderful little phrase. Listen to what he says. "Somehow, in the presence of Jesus, the longest journey is shorter and the hardest battle is easier." Somehow, in the presence of Jesus, the longest journey is shorter and the hardest battle is easier. I wonder if you need to know that tonight. I really think there are people here that need to know that or are joining online. You think, "I'm never going to get to the end of this." And God just wants to say, "I'm here. And I can give you the strength to get through this. All you have to do is let me." But you've got to let him. I've got to let him. And fourthly and lastly, Jesus brings them to safety. There's a very interesting thing happens in John chapter 6, verse 21. "Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going." It sounds like the boat made a kind of jump to the edge of the lake. We don't know what that means, but the journey was shorter because Jesus was with them. It might have been another miracle, who knows? But when you hear that, There's a wonderful sense of Jesus bringing us to a place of safety when we let him. A safe haven, a harbour. I was talking to a friend recently who's just started a church, and he's called it the harbour. I said, why did you call it the harbour? He said, because I want people to know that Jesus is a safe place. I want them to know that when you're with him, he can protect you from the storms. He can hold you when the wind is howling. I thought it was a beautiful name for a church. And he's very excited about it. I want to go back, however, to the Psalms for a minute. Because there's another Psalm, that tells the story of Jesus delivering the people of Israel when they were running away from the Egyptians. It's Psalm 107. Listen to verses 25 to 30. They're recounting what God did for them to set them free. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven, they went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their calamity. They reeled and staggered like drunkards and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they had quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Isn't that beautiful? He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad because they had quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Psalm 107, verses 29 and 30. And I come to this as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus. I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm safe wherever Jesus is. If the storm's waging around me, I'm safe as long as I know he's there. External circumstances don't dictate my peace. The presence of God does. So I don't need to be afraid of storms or uncertainties or attacks. Because when Jesus is there, you have peace. And I wonder if you know that. Those of you that are Christians, do you know the peace that comes from the presence of Jesus? Not waiting on having peace if, but having peace even if. Even if the storm doesn't still, I can have peace. Even if things don't get better, I can have peace. Even in this situation, I can have peace. That's a powerful gift. As a Christian, I also have this sense of promise to me. Jesus is not only my safe haven in this life, but my ultimate destination. I will spend eternity with him, and nothing will ever be able to hurt me again. Christians have this hope. It's called heaven. And we believe that when we die, we are with Christ, and nothing can hurt us. And then one day, we will be reunited with those who have gone before us. And we also believe that the world will end with not disaster and pain and calamity, but that God will do away with injustice. That he'll answer every question, that he'll take every anxiety, that he'll remove every fear, that he'll give people hope who want it. And this is our ultimate hope. The story doesn't end with disaster and calamity and heartbreak for us. It ends with God's victory and grace in our lives. And what God offers you is that kind of peace now. Because Christ died for you, because he bore your sin, because he was buried for you, and because he rose again for you, you can know that peace now. Watching online, watching via Facebook. This morning, 3 people began that journey here in Gold Hill. People who came in to this building not knowing Jesus, left knowing Jesus. Having begun a relationship with him, having decided that they were going to take a step toward him, they discovered that he took a step toward them too. In fact, he ran toward them. And he's here tonight to do the same thing. Now, before I ask you to make a response to this, I just want to come back for a moment to what I said earlier on, we are making our way through all of these signs in John's Gospel, all of these stories of Jesus and the things that he did. There are two that are recorded in John chapter 6. One is Jesus feeding 5,000 people, and the other is Jesus walking on water. What have they got to do with each other? Why does Matthew and Mark and John, why do they all put these two miracles together? What is that all about? Well, let me suggest to you that there are three reasons. For those of you that aren't familiar with the stories, the first story is that Jesus is teaching people and they're hungry and there's not enough food to go round. And a little boy comes with a few fish and some bread and he offers it to Jesus and Jesus feeds 5,000 people with it. The story is one that we explored last week. The second story is the one that I've just told you about tonight of Jesus walking on water. So what does feeding 5,000 people and walking on water, why are they so important? Why do they need to sit together? What can they tell you and me? The early disciples understood. They were all Jewish and they knew the story of Moses. Moses was the leader that God had raised up in Israel to lead the people out of the captivity and slavery of Egypt. And he led them into, across the Red Sea and toward a land called Canaan. And they took a long time to get there, but God used them to do that. The Jewish people celebrated that deliverance at the season of Passover. And we already know that this is the season of Passover because John chapter 6 verse 4 told us that. So the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on the water both tell us that they're in the season of Passover, the time when they are remembering that God raised up Moses to lead them out of captivity and into freedom. The two great stories for which Moses was known, and the stories told in Exodus 1 to 17, for those of you that are interested, is that he led them through the Red Sea, the waves parted. You can read about that in Exodus chapter 14. And that God used him to feed these people for 40 years in the desert with something called manna. When Jesus is portrayed as feeding the 5,000 and walking on the water, he is being presented as a new Moses, as the leader that the people of Israel needed. Just as Moses led the Israelites across the Red Sea, so Jesus leads his people to safety across the Sea of Galilee. And just as God used Moses to provide manna for 40 years in the desert, so Jesus is used to feed 5,000 people. But it goes further. Jesus isn't just a new Moses. Jesus is greater than Moses. Think about it for a moment. Moses had to stand on the edge of the water and wait for it to part before he could lead the people of Israel across it. Jesus walked across the top of it to get to his people in distress. He's greater than Moses. Moses called down manna from heaven, the bread of heaven as it's described in the Old Testament. Jesus said, I am the bread of heaven. He makes it explicitly clear in John chapter 6. So John and Matthew and Mark are doing something intentional. They're saying to these people who are Jewish, in your culture, what you're longing for is a new Moses. Jesus is the new Moses. In our culture, we're longing for someone to give us peace. Jesus is the one that can give you peace. In our culture, we're longing for someone with the answers. Jesus is the only one that has the answers. He's the answer to our culture's deepest problems. And he's the answer to your life's deepest questions. He's able to come alongside us and help us. But there's a third thing. And this is going to sound a little bit odd to you, but it's really important, so follow me with it. When Jesus gets in the boat in John chapter 6, verse 20, and they're frightened, he says something to them. In your Bibles, it says that he says, it is I. Do not be afraid. That little phrase, it is I, is a very important phrase. Let me explain why. In Greek, it is ego eimi, which sounds like an ingredient for some kind of kebab, I know. But he says ego eimi. Let me explain why that matters. That little phrase, which your Bibles mostly translates I am, or I am who I am, or I am he, is used 24 times in John's Gospel. Most of the time, it has another noun after it called a predicate. So he says, I am the bread of life. I am the gate. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the vine. But 3 times in John's Gospel, that phrase, ego eimi, exists on its own. There's no noun afterwards. In John chapter 4:26, when Jesus is talking to a Samaritan woman searching for the truth. Here in our story, when Jesus is talking to the disciples about to get into a boat. And in John chapter 8, verse 58, when he's having an argument with religious leaders about who he is. We see the phrase used in the Old Testament at the beginning of the story of Exodus. When God says to Moses, I want you to lead my people into freedom. Moses is anxious and he says to God, if the Jews ask me, if the Hebrew people ask me who sent me, what am I supposed to say to them? And here's how he responds. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 13, Moses said to God, if I come to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what's his name? What should I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, I am, tell them, I am, has sent me to you. Now here's where it gets exciting. The Bible, the Old Testament, was written in Hebrew. Ego eimi is Greek. The Hebrew phrase that God gives Moses to use is Yahweh. The word that he has to say is Yahweh. I am who I am. It's his name. And it's so holy that the Jews wouldn't use it. So they replaced it with other words or with other lines because it was such a holy word. When the scholars at the end of the 3rd century BC were translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek, they thought, how do we translate God's name, I am who I am, into Greek? And they said, there's only one way we can do it. Ego eimi. So 3 times, in fact 24 times in John's Gospel, but 3 times in particular. Think about that, 24 times. People say Jesus never claimed to be God. Yes, he did. But 3 times in John's Gospel, when he's talking to a woman at a well who's desperate to know who God is, Jesus says, Yahweh, me. When he gets into a boat and they're petrified, what is it that he says to them? He says, Yahweh, I am God. It's me. And when he's having a conversation with Abraham's defendants, the Pharisees and the scribes, he's even clearer in John chapter 8, verse 58. They're saying, who do you think you are? You can't tell us what to do. Where do you come from? Where's your credentials? Where's the proof that we should listen to you? And he looks at them and he says, before Abraham was, I am. What good would just another person be coming to help you in your storm? What's the point of having somebody who's going to make the same mistakes as you? Get into this same mess as you do and not be able to lift you out of it. That's not who walks on the water. The person that walks on the water is God Almighty in human flesh. And he comes to you and he says, there's nothing can stop me getting to you. If you need me, I'm there. And we say, but how do we know we can trust you? Because I am. Because I'm God. I'm not just a man coming to help you. I'm not just a moral teacher. I'm not just a good example. I can walk on the water because I made it. And I can reach you because I know your name and I know where you came from and I know what you're facing. I am who I am. So as you come to him tonight, remember this. He still calms fears. He still knows what you're doing and what you're going through. He still knows your anxieties. And the thing that's inexplicable is that this God, who walked on water and raised the dead and fed the hungry, died on a cross for you and for me. It doesn't matter where you're from. It doesn't matter how many mistakes you've made. It doesn't matter how rotten you feel about yourself. This God is present in this church by the power of the Holy Spirit to give you a fresh start. Maybe you've explored other religions. Stop running. You found the answer in Jesus. He is the answer because he is God in human flesh. And he knows what you're going through. For 2,000 years, Christians have taken bread and wine to remind us that God died for us on the cross. That his son suffered so that we might have life. And maybe you're not yet a Christian. Can I invite you tonight to think about that? To surrender your life to the one who is pursuing you but will not force you to follow him. If you're watching on Facebook or if you're watching on our live stream, let us know. Email my colleague dave.criddle@goldhill.org so that we can pray for you. And we can keep in touch with you and help you. Tonight, God is here. Not just an Irish preacher. God is here. And he wants to change your life. Will you let him?